So welcome everyone to this special meetup hosted by CivicTech Calgary. And we've also invited Data for Good Calgary to join us this evening for a very special presentation on rethinking cities. Before we get started, I'd just like to give a brief overview of CivicTech Calgary for those of you who may not have attended one of our meetups in the past. So really, this is a global movement around civic tech that really talks to the use of technology for public good. More fully, it's the use of technology and data and design to address challenges that citizens and governments face and pursue opportunities for citizen engagement and more effective services as well. So in terms of a diagram, it kind of all comes together, pulling together citizens and government and civil society and the public sector, community challenges and government related challenges as well. And really, civic tech, you can consider it to be an innovation space where people working across sectors come together to build community and to solve problems together. We've been around since June of 2017, over 750 members now, and we're growing rapidly. And as I mentioned, our meetups are generally on the second Tuesday of the month. Many of you joined us through our meetup group. But we'd encourage you and your friends to sign up there, and you'll be notified of all our future events. We also have a website that documents our group, as well as our Twitter handle at CivicTechYYC. So at CivicTech, we really work through projects, and what we're looking for is sort of tech-based solutions that help to improve the lives of Calgarians. We strive to use open technology, technology that can be freely used, and technology put to use for public good. Every year we've kind of done what we call a civic tech hackathon. And these hackathons are used to generate some of these project ideas. We launched with the first one in 2018 and then in 2019. And we're just about to have our 2020 Civic Tech Hackathon in March when everything was shut down. So we'll do it again when we can gather again, hopefully sometime early next year. And at our hackathons and at our meetups as well, we always give opportunities to pitch a project. Working virtually here, it's a bit more difficult, but if you have an idea that you want to pitch, just send me a message in advance of our next meetup, and I'll make sure you get some time on our agenda to pitch your project. And we may even have a bit of a pitch here from the two Davids tonight. We'll see if we can turn that into a pitch. Here's some of the projects that we've launched over the last few years. So Volley, which is an amazing web site and web app that used to gather volunteer opportunities and make them readily available to Calgarians. Been hugely successful over the last couple of years. We have a group working on blockchain experiments for social good, public art mapping project, a wider OmniMap project, something called civic user testing that helps to engage citizens, those that may not have had a chance to engage with technology or the target of many of these apps, those that might be disadvantaged or don't have access to technology. We put them to use to actually test those apps. So it's a user testing group that we're trying to get off the ground. And our latest project more recently is a collaboration between the City of Calgary, the University of Calgary, and CivicTechYYC for wearable technology, so improving urban planning through wearable technology. So these are some of the great ones you can get involved with. And again, if you have your own project idea, please let us know, and we'd be happy to have you pitch your project. So that's it for the intros, and welcome everybody that's joined so far. We're thrilled this evening to have David Finch and David Legg from Mount Royal University. Different areas. We'll have them introduce themselves so they get it right and give you the full story to give us this presentation on rethinking cities. So the recording will be available. The presentation deck will be available as well. We'll have links to those posted on our meetup site under this event in the comments section in the next day or so. If you have any questions as we go through the presentations, please put them in the chat. Those questions will go to me directly, and I'll forward them on during the question and answer period. So without further ado, you guys can share your screen, and we'll launch into this amazing discussion around rethinking cities.
Perfect. Thanks, Jeff. David, why don't you introduce yourself first?
Thank you. I will. Jeff, thanks, first of all, for inviting us to speak. I've learned a lot about your organizations, and just even some of the examples that you talked about certainly intertwine with some of the things that we're going to talk about. The example about Volley that you mentioned, certainly from an active economy perspective, and the research that Dr. Finch and I did, 90% of the organizations that would fit within that are either very, very small or volunteer driven, and we're reliant on volunteers. So certainly that app could come in handy there. And then this idea of wearable tech is certainly one that we've brought within the active economy, companies like Garmin, for instance, and then how it relates to the urban planning is also something that's of interest to us as well, and particularly from a pathway perspective and an active transport perspective. So again, lots of crossover, I think, between what you do, Jeff, with your groups, and certainly what Dr. Finch and I have been talking about, particularly from an active city perspective. But I digress. I'm David Legg. I'm a professor at Mount Royal University. I teach in the Department of Health and Physical Education. So I'm the jock. So I'm the smart one of the two of us. And my background is in high performance sport, and primarily for athletes with disabilities. So lots of crossover there with technology, whether it's racing wheelchairs, prosthetics, LASIK eye surgery for persons who have visual impairments, et cetera, et cetera. So my background is in Paralympic sport. I was the president of the Canadian Paralympic Committee, and that's kind of my main area of interest. Dr. Finch.
Thanks, David. Again, Jeff, thanks very much for the invitation. This is a wonderful opportunity, and hopefully we'll inspire some conversation and identify some potential opportunities for collaboration going forward. So my background, I came into academia relatively late in life. I worked in industry for about 20 odd years. First 10 years really in the tech and telecom sector on the marketing and business development side. And then I migrated onto the agency side. And that really instilled an area that I ended up triggering me to pursue my PhD in, which was really understanding the value of sponsorship, community investment, and philanthropy, and understanding how to more effectively measure those investments and be able to systematically look at their impact on audiences and communities. And that has led me into academia. I am a professor at the business school at Mount Royal, but I work very closely with Ray DePaul, which many of you may know from the Institute for Innovation and Entrepreneurship, as well as James Stotch at the Institute for Community Prosperity. I kind of bridge the two. A lot of the work that we're going to talk about today certainly would fall into the social innovation space as we look at more efficient ways to look at a city and a community and how we can more effectively collaborate to create greater value. So on that, I'll get going. And David, if you want to run some commentary as we move forward, and I'll defer to you certainly on a lot of the active areas.
Sure.
So as soon as COVID hit, like everyone else, I've been sitting in the same chair pretty well now for 6 months. I've been looking at David Legg in the exact same place for the last 6 months. And one of the things that certainly started very early, and this was by the end of March, is the potential catastrophic impact it will have on the areas that we do a lot of work in. And that is specifically areas that we call the experience economy. That looks at areas such as obviously sport, recreation, arts, culture, anything that we called basically had a business model dependent upon the what we call the co-located business economy, where you're fundamentally built a business model around a face-to-face experience. Obviously, one of the anchor elements we'll talk about associated with that is education. Education is by far the largest experience economy sector in the city that has been absolutely turned upside down. As David and I teach our courses until at least next September online, as most universities in Canada are, and many of you probably have children either back at school, either at elementary school or high school. But we actually saw this as potentially an opportunity to look at how we can re-envision some of these fundamentals. We then initiated a process with an organization here in town, Stone Olufsen, which is a market research firm, because what our fear was looking at the nature of both these sectors, specifically looking at the nature of the arts and culture, what we call the creative economy, and the active economy, knowing that 70% of those organizations are volunteer driven, 90% have less than 10 employees. Our fear was in a COVID world, they're going to start deferring to information, data, and evidence from other jurisdictions and contexts. And so what we did immediately was reached out and said, is there an opportunity to pursue an open data project in which we then, in less than 2 weeks, raised about $110,000 from a range of different funders across the ecosystem. And we've got a 12-month study going on, collecting data every 60 days with our partner Angus Reid and Stone Olufsen, that looks at the impacts of COVID on intention to engage in the experience economy, and looking at the psychological and the real risk associated with that and how that may influence behaviors. So that was something that we moved on immediately. That data is publicly available. We're tracking it every 60 days. It's Alberta only data, but we've got samples that isolate both Calgary and Edmonton. So it's a wonderful data set that allows, we're hoping, these smaller organizations to actually have contextual localized data, raw data that they can actually analyze, to be able to use to make better decisions as we move to reopening, as we move to repositioning our businesses. Dave, do you want any comment on that as we move forward?
Yeah, so we've collected 2 rounds of data so far. We're just on our 3rd phase. The results have been interesting, even demographic differences. So middle-aged white men, for instance, are less concerned about returning to live experiences compared to other demographic groups. So we'll be collecting a few more rounds. And I think it's, it's important to point out that this is open access. And it's certainly available for people to use for the purposes, as opposed to, and I love this term that Tim Olufsen used, free search, which is what most people defer to and taking from other contexts that may not be representative of an Alberta scenario.
So I'm going to just step back and really go back a few years, where David and I were involved and collaborated. It's been about a year in advance of the 2026 Olympic plebiscite. And there was a fundamental question that was nagging us around, so what's the purpose of Calgary? What's our purpose? And that really is a black box. And this is something we've been investigating, and it's a bigger question on what's the purpose of a city. Now, what we learned in November of 2018 was the purpose of the city is not to host an Olympic Games and a Paralympic Games. 56% of Calgarians told us that. David and I had spent the previous year interviewing all the members of what were called the Calgary Bid Exploration Corporation to explore their perception of the process, which was very unique, and their perception of the potential value of that process for other potential bid cities. All this research was completed in advance of the plebiscite. And what it taught us and what it showed us was that one of the challenges as a city is we went into this process, unfortunately, and the outcomes, real or perceived, was we were looking at investing somewhere between $10 billion as a city, as a province, as a country, to host an Olympic Games. That was fundamentally the perception. It wasn't a question about building a better city. It wasn't a question about how is it going to help my family. It was fundamentally perceived as it's about the Olympic Games. And that was the fundamental flaw in the process.
And we're not necessarily here to argue that we should have bid for an Olympic or Paralympic Games. In some cases, the data would suggest that would not be something that we would want to do. I think our point here, more than anything else, was that the way it was proposed and the way it was presented, in our opinion, was flawed.
And where it moves us into is this question of the allocation of scarce resources. What is the point of the allocation of any public or private investment? What is the point and the purpose, whether it be investing in facilities, programming, whether it be arts, cultures, education, building roads? This is the allocation of scarce resources. So what's the purpose? And here's my argument as I move forward. I think the purpose is relatively straightforward. It's about them. It's about her. It's about them. It's about them. It is about people. And sometimes we lose that recognition. The future of Calgary, I could have introduced a whole bunch of slides around the current economic situation, the forecasted economic situation, the fundamental socio and structural changes that are happening in our city. And that would be a bleak start to hopefully a positive presentation. But fundamentally, the city is about people, and fundamentally cities are about talent acquisition, development, and retention. There's fascinating research over the last 50 years on how cities have changed. Cities were developed hundreds of years ago and were fundamentally anchored to natural resources. Calgary and Alberta is a walking example of that, of a city that was designed to be able to mobilize, leverage, and extract value from natural resources. Obviously, though, that world has changed. Today, it's about the ability to mobilize and develop human capital, talent. Now, Calgary Economic Development in 2018 recognized this. They launched something called Calgary and the New Economy, which some of you may be aware of. And fundamentally, it was positioned about turning Calgary into the most appealing city in the country for talent, from the acquisition of talent, period. And that was going to be the engine and will be the engine to transform our economy in our city. So, how are we doing? So one of the fascinating parts of this process over the last several years has been working on this project. Calgary, by virtually any global metric, is in a place that most other cities would have a huge, massive desire to be in. This is just obviously an index that's often used and cited by the Economist Intelligence Unit that ranks Calgary as the the first most livable city in North America over a variety of metrics. So what that anchor is livability. But what exactly is livability? What does it mean? I'm a marketing person, right? So I'm all about acquisition and retention. I'm all about understanding customers. This is the data point as a marketer that starts to concern me, right? Over the last decade, the city grew by about 250,000 people. Except for one demographic, ages 20 to 24, we saw a decline of about 5.5%. Structurally, we're seeing a fairly significant exit of people between the ages of 20 and 40 in Calgary. As a marketer, that raises significant concerns as I look at potentially high leverage and high valued customers, future talent, migrating to other jurisdictions. So the question is why, and how do we change this? And this is the opportunity I think we have as a city. When I look at the nature, and when we look at the research associated with nature, how we pick a city, why is everyone on this call living where they live? David lives in Cochrane. I live in downtown Calgary. There may be people from outside of Calgary on this call. why did we choose to live where we live? What are those factors? As a marketer, I look at it as simply another purchasing decision. A purchasing decision that's a high risk purchasing decision associated with the dimensions involved, but it actually has a very similar characteristics to other high risk purchasing decisions, whether that be choosing a university, purchasing a car, buying a house. There's a whole bunch of common characteristics that we look at. And obviously they're highly driven by the individual and the factors that motivate them. So if we look at about the impact of talent and about the attraction of talent, let's look at a variety of different factors that the research suggests matter when it comes to developing and rethinking a city and marketing a city to potential talent, either new talent or retention of existing talent. So these factors up here called economic factors, which range from affordability to career opportunities to housing costs, are some of the more dominant factors the data suggests. Yeah. Interestingly, so is climate. When we look across North American data, climate actually plays a fairly significant role in the relocation of talent. Relations. What research that David and I have done with ActiveCITY that engaged about 23,000 Calgarians, relations matter a whole lot. So that's proximity to friends and proximity to family. As that enters that mix associated with understanding and looking at that value proposition of location. Then there are a variety of 4 other factors that roll to the top. Learning experiences. So that is everything from where are my kids going to go to kindergarten? What are the post-secondary institutions like for those kids when they graduate? What are the educational opportunities? The active experiences in a community. So that's an intersection of access to natural areas, access to organized sport, and access to active recreation opportunities. Creative experiences, which is actually a very broad space that covers everything from arts and cultures to entertainment to hospitality. It looks at that entire sector as an experience and opportunity. And the last element we call, and Stats Canada calls, transversal factors, which are factors that transcend a variety of different areas. So in mobility and talent mobility context, the 3 major transversal factors are issues tied to transportation. So that are issues tied to congestion, accessibility, and public transit. It also ties to the accessibility of the city to other hubs and other locations. Transportation is a critical part of the calculation as we look at the research. The other 2 is safety and cleanliness. They actually are kind of foundational, that people want cities that are safe and clean, period. So that's the mix. That's the kind of the levers we have as a city to look at how do we create a city and rethink a city to not only attract new talent, but really to focus on the retention of existing talent. The challenge with many of those factors, and I'm going to talk about the top 3, is the lack of control of those factors. And I'll pop up a chart here that talks about inputs versus levers. So when I step back and put my marketing hat on, and I look at the potential of launching a product in a new marketplace, I look at the environmental or the input factors associated with that market. What's the current population? What's the socioeconomic profile? What are the competitive dynamics? Those factors are input because I do not have control over those factors. They're not a tool in my toolkit as a marketer. What I do have control over is pricing, positioning of the product relative to the market and the audience I have available to me, potentially reconfiguring the product for that market opportunity. I look at the tools I have in my toolbox to be able to reconfigure and rethink my product to have the maximum opportunity in that community. So on the left-hand side here are what I'm going to call the input factors. The input factors are the macroeconomic characteristics of an urban center, affordability, housing costs, career opportunities, relations. Community leaders, us and political leaders, don't have a whole lot of influence around where mom lives or your best friend lives. They live where they live. And the last thing we certainly don't have control of in this city is climate.
Well,
These are what we call input factors. These are input factors that are not in a toolbox to look at creating a competitive city. What we do have in our toolkit are 4 variables. We have learning experiences down here. The research we've looked at says, for example, up here on the left-hand side, all the economic variables rise to the top. It's one of the dominant variables, whether it be housing costs, affordability, career opportunities. They float to the top, no question about it. Do we have control over those? No. And these are the X and Y axis here. Similarly to relations, similar to climate. However, moving to the right, the red variables are variables that sit in our toolbox. We have influence over the learning system. We have learning over the creative economy and the creative experiences. We have influence over the active experiences, and we have opportunities and the ability to use the transversal variables, whether it be issues of cleanliness, safetiness, and transportation. The red are in our toolbox as city leaders, the gray are not. So this leads me as a marketer to look at the opportunity to reflect on a relatively significant transformation that's happened in the last 2 decades that has looked at the evolution of what we call touch points versus experiences. So we look at it from a marketer. When I started, man, oh man, 30 years ago, a customer dialed in, talked to the call center, then they went to a retail outlet, they got a problem, they talk to billing, they have another problem, they talk to the tech people, move on, right? Somewhere around the early 2000s, starting around the healthcare sector, somebody started looking at this issue tied to the challenges of acquisition, loyalty, and retention, and how it was actually tied to not just measures of customer satisfaction, but actually tied to perceived experience and a relationship associated with those companies defined as an experience journey. And the experience journey says, you know what, I'm more than just a transaction. I am engaged in a coherent, consistent way. What the research shows is that leads not only to increased satisfaction, it leads to increased emotional attachment to an organization. It also leads to significantly increased retention, as well as significantly increased profitability, because of course you get to lower acquisition costs if you're able to retain existing customers. As we started mapping through this concept of looking at experiences, my question was, can we not look at a city as an experience? If you look at the Calgary Economic Plan developed by Calgary Economic Development, Calgary the New Economy, what it focuses on, which is the absolute foundational place we should be, is this concept called place, this concept called placemaking. I want to flip that slightly and say, is not the opportunity to think of a city as an experience? And that would allow us to rethink, just like corporations the last 20 years have done, by taking what we call an institutional view of their touch points with their customers, flipped it to an experience or a customer or a citizen in this context view of an experience. So here's where the data gets interesting. Our research with our partners Stone Olson shows about 99% of Calgarians engage in what we would define as one of those experiences today, focusing specifically at learning experiences, focusing at active experiences, or focusing at creative experiences. 94% of Calgarians engage in multiple experiences across at least 2 of those clusters. Okay, so the world of thinking, David has a customer in the active economy. Somebody at Theatre Calgary has a customer in the creative economy, is fundamentally flawed. We share 94% of all customers. They are in fact experienced customers. That is what drives them first and foremost. And we look at the motivation for why they engage in experiences. The highest proportion is tied to experiential. These are the ability to escape. I'm looking for entertainment. Social factors. I want to do something with friends. I want to meet new people. And then the 3 other factors are tied to health, learning, and a sense of community. These are what motivate people to engage in experiences, which allows us to start looking at how we deliver our city differently, moving from a a city of places to a city of experiences. So let's think about how this impacts the ability to acquire, develop, and retain talent. So I'll walk through a variety of different insights. So I'm going to expand on this first one later, but the first insight is fun, just like we learned with Calgary 2026. It's about creating value for the city. And what we define as value is this concept called community prosperity. Community prosperity is anchored in 4 different forms of prosperity that many of us think about every day. Economic prosperity, both at a community as well as an individual level, right? Human prosperity, often tied to issues of physical and mental wellness. Social prosperity, tied to issues of social cohesion and a sense of belonging. And environmental prosperity, creating a sustainable city for future generations. That is the essence of what community prosperity is. The first insight is everything we invest in, everything we do, every experience fundamentally has to lead back to how did it create value to generate community prosperity. This is where Calgary 2026 failed. Community prosperity is something that most of us reflect on every single day. It what gets us up in the morning, it what allows us to take our kids to school, how we volunteer in community. It's about making a better city. The ability to look at the allocation of scarce resources to say, is investing X better than investing in Y? Does it have greater systemic line of sight, ultimately, to impacting my community, is a significant area that any experienced designer in the future needs to think about. How does it ultimately make our city better? The next insight, it's about the ecosystem, okay? It's not about the silos. It's the intersection of all these learning opportunities, all these experience opportunities in which it creates the magic. It's the 1 + 1 = 3. Currently, experienced designers fundamentally sit in the 3 separate silos. And the transversal designers, the people who think about roads, who think about bike paths, who think about Uber and public transit, are absolutely independent of the experience. Right? Experienced designers who sit in active experiences and learning experiences fundamentally assume that those are just input resources. I have no control over a bike path, or I have no control over a bus schedule. Therefore, they design their experience accordingly. Our position is in fact totally inverted. The experienced designer has to sit at the middle, and the experienced designer that's fundamentally most important is in fact the planner who sits and looks at the city of looking at their transportation system as a system to deliver experiences. How does it deliver experiences? Now, you sit there and go, what does that mean structurally? Well, what does it mean structurally on a corporate side? So how does that fundamentally change many corporations and how they dealt with this issue? They created a position called a CXO, okay, Customer Experience Officer. What did that do? That started consolidating many of the functions and fundamentally accountability and measurement under one person and ultimately one organization that said, we're not measuring organization or operational questions independently in silos. We've got to create accountability. And if you look at some of the structural challenges we face today as a city, at the city level and at the experience level, we sit in silos. We fund silos, we measure silos, right? What this city arguably, I would argue, it needs a CXO. In that CXO toolbox is in fact roads. In that CXO toolbox are bike paths. In that CXO toolbox is everything associated with these 3 experience delivery and the ability to look at it far more holistically. Okay, a second element of the learning ecosystem is just the size of it. It is massive. So this is the number of employees versus the number of enterprises. So if we look across the ecosystem as a whole, it's somewhere around, for call top of mind, about 15,000 organizations and just under 250,000 people work directly in the experience economy. If we look at just the active economy, it volunteers we have about 111,000 volunteers that could donate roughly 15 million hours a year to the active economy. This is a significant ecosystem. Again, the challenge is As a parent, I may volunteer for my child's sport and then go the next day to Theatre Calgary. I am part of the experience economy. I play in many different places. As I wind down here, and we'll move on, I want to talk about the value chain, as this is something we've built in the projects we'll talk about, how we start deconstructing the creation of value. So when we say it's about community prosperity is fundamentally the anchor that everyone needs to look at. We need to then look at how do we allocate resources, and those are targeted called input resources, into the model, whether it be facilities or investment in programming activities. And how does that lead to fundamentally creating outputs that lead to impacts of community prosperity? This is the system that in fact is universal across all the delivery models, but right now it's highly fragmented. A couple of things I'm going to run through. I want to jump on. The fourth insight that we learned working through this process is that people trumps places. When David and I and our team worked on the active economy, we've included in the active economy, we looked at it from a consumer's perspective. That immediately said, guess what? I go on a hike, I don't stop at the boundary of the city of Calgary. I want to go skiing, I go to Lake Louise or Sunshine. What that does, the active economy in our model incorporates 14 towns, 3 cities, multiple national parks, park systems across provincial as well as municipal, and 2 First Nations, and all the school boards that overlay on top of those jurisdictions. When you start looking beyond geography in traditional political jurisdiction, the world changes dramatically. That is a consumer's view, not an institutional view of delivering experiences. I'm just going to jump ahead real quick. I've got 2 more insights, but I want to jump to actions so we have some time to discuss. Now, the last insight I want to focus on that came out of the data over the last 20 years is acquiring talent is fine. Anyone that works in business knows the best customer is the customer you already have. This is where prioritization from a delivery of the experience economy in my world, as we talk about it, has to focus on creating experiences and learning opportunities to transform the talent we have for today to transform to talent we need in the future. Acquisition of new talent is fine, but there's a whole lot of challenges with that from an acquisition perspective. The ability to start looking at the 1.5 million people that we have in the greater Calgary region is really the opportunity. So I want to just walk through some initiatives we have ongoing, that they've been ongoing for about 3 years now, that all fit under this mantra of transitioning from a place to an experience. And this is where COVID, in my mind, creates a huge opportunity. One of the challenges as you look across all these sectors, specifically the active economy, the creative economy, and the learning economy, one of the fundamental challenges is tradition. It's the way we've always done it. And fundamentally, that has a significant barrier on the ability to adapt and change and transform. This is something that David and I have been dealing with over the last 2 years. What we've seen across these sectors, certainly in the last 6 months, is a level of collaboration, a level of recognition that there's a requirement to change. Anyone that sits in a university class right now recognizes we had to pivot every professor in this country to learn how to deliver online. That was a reality of what we've had to do. That then cascades into arts and culture. We've had to learn new ways to deliver value, into the active economy in regards to looking at alternative ways to deliver traditionally co-located experiences. That demand has really accelerated the opportunity for innovation. And that is the opportunity we think will create some opportunities going forward. Going to hit a couple high points and then we'll move on. The first initiative we're working on is what we're calling Measure What Matters. And it's around developing a coherent, integrated, unified community prosperity index for the city. That anyone that's worked across the social sectors, the learning sectors, the public sector knows data is our fundamental problem. We have 27 different ways to measure the same factor. And fundamentally what it leads to is the inability to translate the value of that variable to a broader audience. The goal with this Measure What Matters project is looking across all the potential stakeholders that possess data, collect data, or potentially want data, whether it be on the funder's side or delivery side, to say, is there an opportunity to collaborate to develop a unified scorecard? Now, we've done an audit of dozens and dozens of measurements and indexes globally. The measures exist. What we need is the motivation. It's a combination of technical complexity meets political complexity.
Dr. Finch, is it worth talking about where we got this model from the New Zealand budget process?
Yeah, so this is the anchor for ActiveCITY. Now, what we've done for this 4-quadrant model comes out of, I would encourage anyone to look at what's called the New Zealand Living Standards Framework. Has really done some amazing work on unpacking the measures and metrics tied to each of these 4 variables. What we've done, and I could certainly share a white paper we've developed around this, that looks at auditing a variety of pre-existing Calgary metrics that exist, that are partly good, partly not, but they exist. And what we've done is tried to look at auditing across the system. Where does the data exist today? Is at the level that's required and the frequency that's required, and does it measure what we need? The ability to move to this unified index across social organizations, across private organizations involved in the ecosystems, and obviously public sector organizations, would in fact give us a common language. We would start understanding the impact of interventions.
And just to build on that, measuring what matters, I think, is certainly relevant, particularly in an active economy perspective. An example being active transportation. So if you measure simply the numbers of kilometers of cycling tracks, Calgary wins. Yet when you measure other active transportation metrics, numbers of users, those sort of things, we don't score very well at all. And so it's kind of an interesting comparison point. We may have the most track, but it's not being used effectively or efficiently. And so again, what you measure obviously matters in this particular instance.
The second pillar, what we've been working on for the last year and a half, is what we call Learning City. Learning City is looking at, we released 2 reports in the June timeframe called Calgary on the Precipice. And we believe that we have to learn our way forward. And learning our way forward is about focusing internally at the assets we have called people, and looking at having to fundamentally reinvent the learning system from kindergarten forward. But it reinvents the learning system. I won't get deep into the complexity of this Learning City model, but the most important part of it for this call is this concept called open learning. The open learning system fundamentally says, you know what, if you look at learning traditionally, and frankly how it's traditionally measured from at the provincial funding perspective, there are about 405 institutions in Calgary that quote unquote deliver accredited learning. If you invert that and put a learner's lens on that and say, where do I learn? Okay, we start learning at the public library. We start learning at playing hockey when you're 5 or playing cricket when you're 15. You start learning a fitness class. You start learning an art class. You start learning through experiential opportunities, either through accredited learning or through non-accredited learning. The learning system explodes, of which 98% is unaccredited. An open learning system says we need to start mapping the system more coherently, and that fundamentally reflects on putting the individual learner first. That reinvents the learning system. David, I'm going to let you run some commentary on ActiveCITY and how it fits into the model.
Sure, thank you. So the active economy and ActiveCITY was, again, the brainchild resulting perhaps from the failed plebiscite in the Olympic and the Paralympic bid for the 2026 games. And there were a number of other kind of conversations, discussions about the field house and whether or not that would ever be built, conversations about the cycle tracks in downtown Calgary. Those sort of things led us to ask, whether Calgary was still a great sports city. And it then led us down a path where we started to examine what we coined to be the active economy. And admittedly, we did borrow from the work of Richard Florida and the creative class and the creative economy. But what we decided was that the active economy was more than just what most people would have defined as high performance sport or active recreation. So we broadened it to include areas such as sport betting, to include things like e-sport. That was an interesting debate as to whether or not that fit within the active economy. But we tried to think broader as opposed to narrow, and we were able to come up with 10 different component pieces to the active economy that we think actually represents about 4,000 different corporations or organizations, within a Calgary context. And so we would argue that the active economy, the active ecosystem, is significant within a Calgary context, and, I'm biased, could actually become the calling card of Calgary, similar to what, for instance, Nashville does with the music industry, or Boston does now with medical technology. We would also argue that the active economy was perhaps similar to the medical technology industry in Boston, and that it was overlooked. It was not recognized and identified as a significant player within the Boston economy for the exact reasons that Dr. Finch mentioned earlier, in that siloed nature. They were never put together under one big umbrella piece. So the point that we're at right now with the active city and the active economy is we've gone through about a 2-year process. We're just about to launch what we're calling Playbook 2030, which is our strategic plan, for lack of a better way to describe it, but an action plan helping Calgary move forward until 2030 to be Canada's and the world's most livable city through what we are referring to as our greatest natural asset, which we believe is the active economy. So again, Dr. Finch made reference to that we engaged 23,000 Calgarians, which we think is the largest public engagement process to date in Calgary, asking them why they choose where they live, what about the active economy encourages them to stay in Calgary, what attracted them to Calgary. I mean, Avenue Magazine just last month had their issue on, the greatest communities within Calgary. And of the 10 metrics that they measured to determine what was a great community, I think 8 of them were kind of related to the active economy. So we're seeing it as a significant player and an important aspect of, again, what attracts and then what retains Calgarians.
And a big part of this playbook that evolved was this idea of active transportation. It's the knit that connects the elements together, whether it be bike paths or other path or public transit for that matter. The ability that when we started looking at this and doing research, what became apparent to users is the question of how am I going to get there? And all of a sudden, the issue of this transversal economy came absolutely dependent. It was absolutely a critical driver of the active economy. Now, the last element I'm going to talk to this very briefly before we go to questions is a project we've just initiated. Now, if you look at the ActiveCITY in the Playbook 2030, the tagline we've used is not an accident because it philosophically goes where we're going, which is a guide to building Canada's most livable region. It is not about sport. It is not about recreation at any level, fundamentally. It is about building a great city and the asset we have called the active economy to do that. Now, as we started doing that, we started entering conversations as we started looking at crossover between the creative economy and the active economy. And this is a project we've just initiated with our partners at CADA and other organizations in developing what we call Rise Up the Creative City project, which is actually looking at modeling the exact same element, but looking at the assets of the 4 creative sectors, which is the cultural sectors, the cultural industries, the creative industries, and the transversal industries, how they intersect of the part of the creative economy to be able to contribute to livability in our city more coherently. This is how they all start coming in together as part of this experience economy asset. Now, this is where I want the pitch before we go to questions is there is a lot going on here. Every single one of these opportunities across the 4 activity projects we have right now, so Measuring What Matters, Learning City, Active City, and the Creative City, all fundamentally data driven, right? They're either data rich or the data's bad. And this is an opportunity when Jeff and I started talking probably 4 months ago, the ability to look for opportunities because This is where we need to move forward, especially given the scale and scope we're dealing with across all these areas. You get 20,000 organizations employing 250,000 people, and 70% of them have no employees. Therefore, data is king on trying to move this forward. So I want to thank everyone today for this opportunity. We have a hell of a lot of work ahead of us as a city to not just get through COVID. COVID's going to be the low-hanging fruit. We have a lot of work far beyond COVID. So again, thank you very much for the opportunity tonight to talk.
Well, thanks to both of you. It's a fascinating story, and it's amazing how you've kind of put all the pieces together in a very cohesive framework that really makes a lot of sense. So that's great that your deck will be available to the participants, because it's going to take time to go over it and try to have it sink in. So there has been a number of questions that have come in. I would encourage those on the call to put your questions or comments into the chat box, and we will get to them as we go through. I guess kind of my first question is around the measure what matters, and the potential kind of work that has to go on there. And when you start thinking about it, it becomes totally overwhelming. And so my question to you is, like, how are you going to parse that down into a process or phases that are actually going to be doable? Because you can't do it all at once. It's way too big. So how do you prioritize? How do you get some quick wins to provide evidence for the value of these indicators and measuring what matters?
We've been providing opportunities for our undergraduate students to help us collect data.
Yeah, and one of the interesting challenges here, Jeff, is it's a fire hose, right? Yeah. In today's environment, the problem often isn't the data; it's too much data. So yeah, the conversations we've started, because Jeff, you were part of these early conversations, I call it the discovery stage. And the discovery stage is we start talking across the different sectors and looking at individuals that might be partners. And the partners might be, they're currently collecting data that needs to be amplified, or they need the data. For example, funders that need to start understanding line of sight towards the value of their investment impacting community. So from a going forward perspective, it's about building a consortium of people who are interested in moving this forward. I call this is the intersection of politics and technical complexity, because there's a ton of technical complexity associated with doing this right, and there's a ton of political complexity to get the right people on board. So I am going eyes wide open in these conversations with all our partners to see if we can move this forward. But I'm with you, and all this stuff is about small scale, quick wins, demonstrate the opportunity to do this in an effective, agile, and adaptive way, and then move forward.
Okay, well, that's great. So I guess the opportunity for Data for Good and for Civic Tech, I guess, is to stay involved, stay in the loop, and then as some of those specific projects or tasks or challenges get put out there in a tangible way, then we can respond to it with our volunteer base and try to be helpful. So that's how that will proceed.
And Jeff, simultaneously, the opportunities that your team across both organizations may be aware of in regards to how it's been done in others' jurisdictions. Mm-hmm. We've done a whole bunch of mining to understand how we can do it efficiently, and we want to bring, the last thing we want to do, and no one on this call wants to do, is reinvent what's already been done. So the ability for us to learn from what is good and what is done well would be enormously valuable.
Right.
Yeah, particularly the comparisons from city to city, province to province, and federal to city, and all those comparison points are one that we're not struggling with, but certainly having some challenges with.
Right. Yeah. All right. So let's dive into some of the questions. So at the very start of the presentation, you talked about the surveys that you'd done a couple times and the data that you had collected and the fact that it was open data. But so where does that stuff reside? And if somebody is interested, or we're interested as a group getting access to the data, how do we do that?
Just Google Stone Olson new experience economy research. I don't have the URL with me right now, but it's
Sure, I'll call it up right now.
Yeah, the data's open. Post it on the chat if you could, Dave.
Yeah.
You'd be able to pull down, what you can pull down is the PDFs from the research. You just then subscribe to the research and you can subscribe to the raw data.
Okay, great. So the how do new technologies shift how decision making occurs in the public sphere? Kind of moving direct versus representative voice, expert versus popular opinion. And so as technology becomes more pervasive, how does that change these sorts of things, in your opinion?
I'll give my 2 cents. So my 2 cents is people make decisions regardless of whether it's a commercial decision about a product, purchasing a product, whether it's tied to a social organization, tied to a public decision. Fundamentally, those are the decision-making processes are, in fact, I call CRA agnostic. And therefore, the ability for technology to facilitate, as we've seen, and as we will see, the challenge, Jeff, across many of these problems is they remain in silos. I can start dealing with data or decisions associated with the public sector or with the social sector or a specific organization. That I call the vertical data. The opportunity is the horizontal data. I need to start looking across sectors and organizations and ecosystems more effectively, and that is where the data breaks down right now. The ability to consolidate, to use that data, and make better decisions, I think is enormous going forward.
I think, well, there's always going to be pros and cons, but I think technology in many respects can become an equalizer for marginalized groups, perhaps, who haven't been able to be actively engaged in all those three areas, whether it's the learning economy, the experience economy, or the active economy. And I also think it provides an opportunity to have conversations and make decisions based on evidence, as opposed to anecdotes and gut feels. So, an example might be the cycle tracks. And so technology provides us to actually know how many people are using them, when they're using them, as opposed to, I didn't see anybody on my drive this morning as I was commuting, and so therefore they're useless and they're a waste of time and a waste of space. So I think technology can make for better conversations and then hopefully better decisions.
But I'll challenge that, because I agree with that, is good data only works with good stories, right? And we have no shortage of data right now. We have poor data stories, and that collision, that opportunity is, I think, where we have an ability to start moving the city forward across all these three areas.
Yeah. Well, it's that paradigm of data to information to knowledge.
Yeah, the wisdom to use the data that you're. Yeah,
absolutely. Earlier on, you talked about some work that had been done for the Olympic Bidco reports that were provided to them. Are those reports available to the public?
Yeah, I can call those up too. We did a couple of kind of studies looking at that. One was just the process in and of itself, the CBAC that Dr. Finch referred to, the Calgary Bid Exploration Committee, which at that time was like not a totally unique approach, but there were only a couple of other cities that had even tried to do that model. And so we examined that approach towards whether or not a city should bid for an Olympic and Paralympic Games. So we assessed that. And then we also wrote a number of op-eds following the plebiscite and, our kind of feelings on whether Calgary was still a great sports city and still could consider itself an Olympic city. And those more sort of emotive, kind of effective types of conversations. But yeah, I'll post those as well right now.
Okay. And what that deconstructed, Jeff, was the process and the flaw of the process that I think actually, I always say you learn a lot more through your mistakes. And I think that fundamentally, from a public engagement and design perspective was a massive learning curve for the city that we are trying to build from and learn from, because that was from all kinds of measures a fail.
Right. So, a question about how do provincial and national aspects kind of factor into local decision making? So, like these 20 to 24-year-olds, do they leave Calgary, or do they leave Alberta, and kind of where are they going, right? Like, how does the other provinces and nationals fit into that local thinking?
It's a competition. Again, I'm the marketer. We compete every single day for assets. Both my boys have left or are leaving Calgary, right? One's at U of T, one's at UVic. That is the risk we have. We are not leveraging the assets we have to, in fact, create opportunities for them, and that's the personal bleed I'm seeing in regards to that. And what we need to do is fundamentally, the challenge we have is brands are multi-layered, reputations are multi-layered. We can create all the branding we want for the city of Calgary, and that can be done undone instantly at a provincial level. And this is the challenge with having a multi-layered brand. As a brand manager, we control only a piece of our brand. And this is where not having alignment is a significant liability for the city.
And some of the social factors. So how does diversity, for example, factor into resilience and the attractiveness of a city?
Data-wise, it's a huge factor. It's an absolute huge factor. What we don't sell and why we lead, certainly in the reports we are publishing, is Calgary's the third most diverse city in the country. Yeah. It is something that is a massive asset that we are under leveraging in our ability to ensure we affect it. The challenge we have as a city, Jeff, is our city has grown faster than our governance structures and our processes. And therefore, the governance structures and processes do not represent the city of 2020. And that is the fast track that I believe COVID can fundamentally reinvent. Because until that changes, it's going to be, frankly, three white guys called David, Jeff, and David as the alleged puppet masters, and that has to change instantly, because that is not sustainable as a city, nor is the right thing to do socially.
Yeah. It's an interesting problem. I mean, I am still learning very much in this. We've been hosting Thursday, we're calling future making sessions, focusing on the active economy on different topic areas. And one we hosted a few weeks ago was on esport. And, we had 3 speakers lined up who were all white men. And, we were promoting it and posting it, and we got called on that from a couple of people, and rightfully so. And so we had to dig deeper, and we had to work a little harder to make sure that we were presenting people that were reflective of the industry and the diversity and the inclusivity that we wanted to portray. And so we're certainly far from perfect, and we acknowledge too our own demographic that we fall within. And it's been an interesting journey for us, because we've certainly reached out to try and, like, we hosted one on Aboriginal, Indigenous, First Nations and how it related to the active economy a couple of weeks ago. So, and I'm not trying to say that, we've checked that box and now it's done, but it's a process that we're working through, an ongoing one.
So there's been a lot of effort and a lot of talk around sort of the Calgary as a tech hub, kind of growing the tech economy. I'm wondering, through your research, your surveys, what sort of evidence do you have, and what is the perception of Albertans generally about Calgary's tech experience and infrastructure?
I can't speak to data specifically, Jeff. I'd have to go back and look at some of the data. Here's the reputational challenge, either as an asset or a liability, right? We are overwhelmed with the perception of an oil and gas city, right? This is what leads to the bleeding of a bunch of 20-year-olds. This is what, when Dave and I talk to our students, the bleeding of our students looking for other sectors they do not believe exist here, right? The narrative, and these organizations are ones facilitating that narrative, has to change. Part of the active economy narrative, Jeff, is actually talking about active tech and fit tech, because we believe that's the convergence of again, talking about things like mobility technologies and the ability to look at wearables. The city has a 25-year, 30-year history, if you go back to YLAN and before that, in the wireless space. Garmin is here for a reason because of our history. It's something that no 20-year-old knows anything about.
Well, you made mention that I live in Cochrane. I mean, Cochrane is trying to position itself as a bit of a wearable tech hub, right? With both Garmin and 4i as two examples. I think Calgary could do the same.
Okay. Question about sort of data collection and kind of, the cost and the ease of kind of the low-hanging data versus some of the data that might be more valuable or interesting. But so I guess in your experience, how much of a role does the cost of collecting data play into aggregating the data measures, right? Like, is it,
part of the challenge is trying to compare apples to apples. And, so for instance, trying to get, the data from a city of Calgary perspective, like we found, I think there are 17 policies that we found within the city of Calgary that relate to the active economy. And then trying to find the various data sources that link to those 17 policies, like they're not all consistent. And then if we wanted to compare ourselves to other like cities, like a Hamilton or a Winnipeg or a Edmonton or something like that, again, they operate differently too. So for us to then go in and redo the data collection would just not be feasible. So we have to kind of rely on what we have available to us.
Well, except the other side of it is when we look at our partners in the active economy. So our partners involve everyone from Calgary sport and entertainment, and all the data. And David and I do a fair amount of work with them. There's endless amounts of data available there. RCR. Every time you go skiing at an RCR resort, you're scanned. That's data. The Calgary Stampede. When you open that floodgate and look at our partners in the active economy and the amount of data that's already collected, most of it's either the systems are not coherent or the way they collect it is not coherent.
Right.
So the ability to actually the data work together is holding the ecosystem back. The ability to start looking at these things systematically that says when the Flames and the RCR, the Calgary Stampede, collect certain data points, obviously there's a whole bunch of proprietary data that is going to be proprietary data, but there's a whole bunch that can be used as a public asset moving forward. It is not being done today because they're being done in silos at the organizational level.
there was mention of the ranking of the communities in Calgary. So we have a comment here that this individual's community went from number 1 a few years ago to number 47 this year. So,
What happened?
So what happened? Yeah, what really changed? So what am I missing? In terms of what do Calgarians think is important or not important to them? Or I mean, is it the editors of the magazine? Like, what's going on, right? And how do we know what indicators or mechanisms mean to anybody?
Bad data, Jeff. Bad data, man. No, honestly, this is like the challenge with everyone on this call knows this. You can rig data any way you want it to do, and that's the challenge with ranking systems that inherently assign a value and a weighting to certain variables, right? And why open data is far better. When you look at ranking of education systems in universities, those closed ranking systems, you have no idea about the underlying source of that data, how it's weighted. So don't get me going on ranking systems because they're fundamentally it's a marketing tool.
This is the Maclean's rankings just came out for universities, and so Dr. Finch and I are quite aware of these sorts of rankings and the data that they collect.
Garbage. And that's the problem. Garbage is used to make decisions,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Whether it be about where my kids go to school or where we live, and it's bad data being made to make worse decisions. And that is where we see an opportunity through collaboration.
right, right. So there's some compliments here on the model that you guys have developed and you know, kind of the practicality and usefulness of it. Are there, or have you observed sort of city-related organizations and governments acting on that kind of model? Is it just getting started?
I'm going to say, David, why don't you talk about ActiveCITY and I'll talk about the other ones because ActiveCITY is the most mature at this stage.
Yeah, I mean, we're getting a little bit of traction and interest from some city councilors, for instance. Some people have suggested that some might even in the next election run on a platform that identifies the active economy as part of their kind of part of their platform moving forward. We've gotten fairly good buy-in from the players within what we would consider to be the active economy in a Calgary context, whether it's the facility side of things like the Wind Sports of the world, the Repsol Centers, Spruce Meadows, whether it's more the umbrella organizations like the City of Calgary or Sport Calgary, and then certainly the professional sports side, Calgary Sports Entertainment Corps, the two universities. Like people are buying into this concept and I think recognize the value of working together. But like most things, that's the hard part, right? Is getting people actually to collaborate. Like this Stone Olufsen example was an interesting one because again, it happened really fast and we just kind of threw it out there and saying, look, people, we're in the midst of this pandemic. We need to figure out and understand the return to a live experience if that ever happens. And we need to just pitch in a few bucks here and there and we'll get this, we'll cover the costs to run it. And then it'll be open access and it'll benefit everybody. And it was actually really interesting to see how people bought into it. And again, this was one of the first times, from my experience anyways, where the arts community worked with the kind of the sport and recreation community. Like you don't see that happen very often. This idea of an experience economy that Dr. Finch has kind of positioned, as simple as it is really quite novel. And a lot of it is just like, duh, like why didn't anybody think about or talk about this earlier? But I guess it's just, you get into your own little space and you don't necessarily look outside of those confines very often. And like, listen, in academia, we're brutal with that, right? I mean, the fact that someone from, phys ed is working with somebody from the business school, it's just, it's unheard of. It's completely celebrated within the institution, right? Because we're actually talking to one another in different departments. But again, it happens so seldom. So we're just trying to figure out better ways to connect and communicate and collaborate with each other.
So on the learning side, that's the one I believe has the most opportunity going forward, other than ActiveCITY. And that is because the city and the province and the systems are under massive duress and will be under massive duress. You've got multiple activities happening moving forward with the UCP around curriculum redesign and the Vision 2030 for their future post-secondary. At the end of the day, that's going to lead to greater accountability. How do I turn my first 2 political science degrees into value? How is the course I teach in X perceived as valuable? Because if I can't connect those dots, I'm not going to have a customer called a student, and I'm not going to have any employers want to buy what I'm building with them. There's the problem. So I believe we have an opportunity, and I believe the traction we've got across different parts of the learning ecosystem is actually surprising because they see change coming. They can either be driving that change or the change can be driven on them. And this is an opportunity we believe with Learning City to actually be in the driver's seat for some of these initiatives.
In terms of the measuring what matters and some of the indicators that you're kind of talking about, there is a lot of stuff out there, and there's a comment around the well-being index and various other indices that some of which are Canadian, some of which are international. And I guess to what degree have you looked at those sorts of things, and are they being incorporated, or how are you going to manage that very broad field of vast number of indicators and frameworks that are out there?
I mean, from the active economy perspective, I think we looked at about 10 different ones internationally. And then the two that stuck with us was the one from New Zealand. And what was the second one, Finch? The
The OECD.
OECD one. Those are the two that we landed on. Now, why we picked those two and how we picked those two, there's probably some internal bias with that.
And the measuring that matters that, that process is early stage, but it is building on that global benchmarking. So if you look at the Canadian Index of Wellbeing at the University of Waterloo as an example, we've been in conversations with colleagues at McGill who are looking at different models. The last thing I want to do across any of this point, because it moves back to what neighborhood you should live in, rigor and validity are first and foremost, and that comes through usage and time. Right. So the last thing we need to do is define a Calgary unique measure of literacy or mental health. There are endless measures. We just have to look at what's rigorous and valid and how can they be applied here. I have less concern around the actual measures themselves. I think there's going to be no shortage of valid measures that the consortium could identify. The challenge ultimately will be the level of data that's going to be required to be collected for them to be used and operationalized by community members, and the frequency of that data so they can be used. And those two variables are important. And then importantly, what are they relative to? Having Calgary data without comparative baselines, either with ourselves longitudinally or with other communities concurrently, the data is useless without any baseline, right? And so those are the technical challenges I think are going to be as important as the political challenges.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Good. So does your research distinguish or identify difference between attracting and retaining individuals versus attracting and retaining businesses? Do these same factors apply to attracting business investment? So like at what level do we think about that, attracting and retaining?
That sits at the domain of our friends at Calgary Economic Development, like Mary Moran. All I know from an institutional side is everyone knows it's about talent drives business. I don't care what business you're in, it's about talent, accessible talent. So I think my view has always been and continues to be, especially on the Learning City side, is we need to build an adaptable and agile workforce, and the investment, either new companies organically being built here or companies moving here, will be attracted to the talent base. That is that's the baseline of our competitive position.
Right.
And just on that, we are historically in a very strong position. If you look at the data around the quality of education, the level of education, the learning outcomes here, there's enormous at both a domestic as well as global level. Yeah. Is that the right stuff we're teaching is a reasonable question going forward.
Right. Yeah, the education system in Alberta is in some respects the envy of the world. University of Alberta and University of Calgary are identified as top 100 universities in some scales. SAIT and NAIT, from a technical perspective, are again the envy of the world. University of Lethbridge, now Maclean's rankings, as Dr. Finch alluded to, maybe isn't perfect, but I mean they score the highest, for the primarily undergraduate. And then there's Mount Royal University, which is of course outstanding as well.
It's Canada's Harvard. So one of the comments I would have around that though is I would encourage people to look at our Learning City reports. One of the things, we work very closely with employers and understanding what employer wants and needs are. Been doing research in that field for about 10 years around employability skills. What I found very interesting was the fact that fundamental skills transcend sectors and transcend disciplines. So what we did as part of that study was actually audited and studied 16 different competency models. We looked at everything from the UK policing competency model to systems engineering, to nursing, to accounting. And what was interesting about that study, and this is what we highlight and where it's the pivot point for the learning system, 70% of all competencies are common. So I don't care if you're a systems engineer at NASA, a police officer in London, or a nurse in Calgary. 70% of the metrics you're going to be measured against from a competency perspective are common, right? They're the stuff we should have learned in kindergarten, right? Now let's look at the education system. It's totally inverted. The education system is built on domain skills, not what we call enabling skills. There's the accountability problem. That's how we talk about learning system. The learning city is about flipping that learning model upside down.
Question about is there a city think tank, you know, outside of kind of these kind of discussion we're having here? You've mentioned your various initiatives. Are these different groups working on this, or is there an Uber group that's on top of that in terms of this think tank? Or maybe just explain how it all connects, and if somebody wants to get involved, how can they do it?
So and there's the silo problem, right? So for example, I'll go to Learning City as an example. Learning City intentionally, it's back to the intentionality. We brought in profs from U of C, profs from psychology, profs from computer science, profs from Alberta University Arts to be part of that consortium, because we knew it couldn't just be, you know, 2 profs or 3 profs at one institution having this conversation. That takes intentionality. So that is what we've called an open learn. That we've created something called the Learning City Lab, which is in fact a consortium of different individuals, not institutions. And that is where I believe the sweet sauce is the ability to look at individuals before institutions. One of the other challenges we have as a city is structured on silos. We have different civic organizations for different pieces of the puzzle. All the people are wonderful and very collaborative, but they still have the fundamental structural reporting and funding model that still sits in silos. And I think there's an opportunity. When I talk about shifting from place to experiences, it's actually starting to look at that CXO model, which is a far more holistic approach. So where we want to go with that think tank, I believe my intent is to start converging this all under James Stotch's Institute for Community Prosperity, and starting to form that as the hub for some of this collaborative thinking. James, frankly, has been a huge part of the funding process across all these initiatives.
Does James know that he's going to become the hub of that?
This is being recorded, is it?
We could play it for him. So there has been a number of links put into the chat, so I would encourage people to look at that. You know, the basic links, I guess, to, you know, ActiveCITY and Learning City and Creative City can be found through Google. So I would encourage people to do that.
The Google.
You mentioned the future making sessions and various other webinars and things. Those are publicly open and available, or how do people connect with those?
So the future making in particular, I did put up a link for it. Yeah, more the merrier.
Okay.
And there's a whole series of podcasts. I think we're up to about 20 podcasts now for both Learning City and ActiveCITY. And the podcasts really are identifying civic leaders across different parts of the sector to talk about the vision of their vision of Calgary, whether it be tied to learning or the vision of whether it be tied to Calgary as an active city.
All right, fantastic. Well, we're rapidly have run out of time here. It's been a great presentation, a lot of interest. There's been just tons of questions, and unfortunately we can't get to all of them in the time we're allowed. But I would just thank you two gentlemen very much for all you're doing and all you're doing for the city. It's going to make a huge difference. And for all of us on the call, I guess the challenge is to find a way to get involved and to support these types of initiatives. So we can make Calgary a better place to live for ourselves and for our future generations.
Wonderful. Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you.
All right. Well, good night to everybody on the call, and take care, stay well, and join us for future CivicTechYYC and Data for Good meetups in the future. Bye now. Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.